Let me just mention at the beginning of this second panel of the 16th International Conference on Unity and Plurality in Europe. My name is Andrea Feldman, and I'm going to be moderating this panel that is going to deal with history, ethnic nationalism, and fundamentalism. I just wanted to mention that this session is going to be recorded, and let you know that our presenters are going to have some 10 minutes to present their presentations. We will then hopefully have some time for a discussion that will follow. I will let you know through a chat, so please be sure that you have it on when your time is up. So have a note of that. Let me start then by asking Professor Ivo Goldstein of the University of Zagreb to open this panel with the discussion of anti-Semitism in Croatia, Serbia, and Bosnia since 1990. Please, Professor Goldstein. Professor Goldstein, we do not hear you. Hello, can you hear me, Ivo? Can you hear me? Please unmute Ivo. Okay. Hello, can you hear me? Yeah, you can hear me, but we cannot hear you. So something seems to be wrong.
Audio.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's okay now. Please proceed. Yeah, thank you.
Well, something went wrong. I don't know why. Maybe I switched off or switched on. Anyway, thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you, Andrea. Thank you for organizing this meeting and letting me say something in 10 minutes, I hope, about the anti-Semitism in the last 30 years. Of course, when you speak about last 30 years, we have to give something what was before, and it has to be underlined that in the first two decades of socialistic Yugoslavia, there were practically no anti-Semitic incidents, particularly not official or state-supported, as in other countries of the Eastern Bloc. This happened due to many factors. Important was the attitude of Tito himself, and he was sincere partisan of national and religious equality, and he hated every kind of hate speech and bigotry. The Jews could not have been an exception. Nevertheless, in the 70s and in the 80s, when limited democratization and liberalization took place, the consequence was, among other things, that anti-Semitic incidents in public and in the media were becoming more and more often. This started with, I would say, with 1967, more or less, with outbursts of so-called anti-Zionism, which easily evolved into a specific variety of anti-Semitism. And there were, Yugoslavia voted in 1975 in UN for the resolution that Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination. Then Yugoslavia sheltered some of the highly ranked Palestinian terrorists in the 80s, including Abu Abbas, who was ringleader of the infamous 1985 hijacking of an Italian cruise liner, Achille Lauro, where the people, one Jew was killed, etc., etc. So, but nevertheless, one has to underline that anti-Semitism was never a dominant characteristic of the public life, neither in socialistic Yugoslavia, nor in the newly formed states after its dissolution. Nevertheless, the anti-Semitic incidents were an unmistakable indicator that something in the society went wrong. Hatred against the Jews in the broader context means nowadays that there are social groups and individuals who are dissipating hatred against all possible or presumed opponents and enemies. These groups belong generally to the extreme right, but there are some on the extreme left as well. In the language of the newly invented rightist, fundamentalistic, anti-modernistic, conservative, and nationalistic politics, the Jews are among those who are different and who are the others. In the Serbo-Croatian Bosnian language, we would translate it against all drugih I drugačiji. That means drugi I drugačiji are our enemies, opponents, including the Jews. This campaign against the different and the other started in Serbia in what we would say mid-80s of the 20th century, before it was developed in other Yugoslav republics. Various publicists, on the basis of the data torn out of context, exaggerated, distorted, and even fabricated data, and were trying to prove that the Serbs have been cheated, killed, destroyed even after the genocide, and finally, that they were eternal winners in the war and losers in the peace. All this led to theories about the worldwide anti-Serb conspiracy. This newly composed history was intensified, especially after Slobodan Milošević came to power in 1997. Why is it so important that I, in this short paper, had to underline this? Because parallelly, we were witnessing the rise of anti-Semitism. For example, in 1983, in Belgrade, in the book written by Mihailo Popovski, A Secret World of the Freemasons, Tajanstveni svet Masona, the notorious, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, was cited as an alleged truth about the Jews. At that moment, this book was of marginal reach, far from being the mainstream, but it was one of the many which announced growth of anti-Semitism in the 90s. By the way, the first edition of the Protocols in Yugoslavia were published in Ljubljana in a student monthly magazine, Tribuna, in 1988. The second was published in Belgrade in 1993. In following few months, protocols appeared in Belgrade in 2 additional editions. Well, I have a couple of minutes, so I only can say that anti-Semitism had in previous 30 years all kinds of faces. In Bosnia, in Serbia, in Croatia. For example, there were statements in which the killing or harming of Jews was justified in the name of a radical ideology or an extremist view of religion. There were statements about the world Jewish conspiracy, of Jews controlling the media, economy, government, or other institutions. There were accusations of the Jews as a people of being responsible for real or imagined wrongdoing committed by a single Jewish person or group. The Jews were accused even for acts committed by non-Jews. There were also minimizations of the Holocaust committed by the National Socialist Germany and its supporters and accomplices during World War II, and accusations of the Jews as a people or Israel as a state of inventing or exaggerating the Holocaust. Some were accusing Jewish citizens of being more loyal to Israel or to the alleged priorities of Jews worldwide than to the interests of their own nations. Antisemitism is also drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis and holding Jews collectively responsible for actions of the State of Israel. I will refer directly only to two very specific forms of anti-Semitism, a characteristic for former Yugoslavia. At the beginning of the 90s, in the fervent nationalistic skirmishes, Jews were used and abused in various ways. One of the frequent patterns were false manifestation of philo-Semitism. Wars in Croatia and Bosnia in the 90s were probably the first time in history when the Jews were presented as friends by all warring nations. Warring sides, sorry. Namely, the historical data from the history of a respective nation have been carefully selected so they would lead to a conclusion that there was no anti-Semitism in our country, and then that we were always friends with the Jews. At the same time, and it was not true, it's just picking up certain information in a very selectively manner and method, and simply it's half true. On the other side, at the same time, however, these ruling elites on the domestic political scene were indirectly or even directly promoting certain anti-Semitic theses. The reason for this false philo-Semitism was alleged strong influence of Israel or of international Jewish organizations in the world politics. Second thing I have to underline is historical revisionism. And it is in all post-1990 countries tolerated and even encouraged. Revisionists argue in the three countries that collaborationists in the Second World War who belong to their own nation, they insist that Ustaša in Croatia and in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Chetniks and members of Nedić government or Ljotić movement were just defending interests of their own people. Their responsibility or guilt for the Holocaust and genocidal actions is denied. There is no doubt that this is anti-Semitism too. To conclude, in those years, the territory of former Yugoslavia experienced a climax of irrational nationalism and chauvinistic hatred, which further increased the danger of anti-Semitism. At the same time, sociologist late Laszlo Sekel stated that the former Yugoslavs hate each other enough. They don't need Jews to hate. But nevertheless, all chauvinists and fascists always have an additional need for hatred. As we well know, in history, this space has usually been filled by the Jews. So what we can say to conclude today in 2021, it is more than 20 years since the last war operations were finished in the Yugoslav wars. I refer to the war in Kosovo. The situation regarding anti-Semitism and mutual hatred has changed for better, but still it is omnipresent. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Goldstein. There are obviously few ideas that could be and most probably will be discussed, but we will continue with our presentations and then have a discussion later. I would like to ask now Desmond Maurer to tell us something about symbolic games, conceptual aporias, and naming the constitutive exception with Wegelin, Wittgenstein, and Lyotard. Desmond, can you take a stand?
Yes, I can. Thank you very much. Thank you, Andrea. And thank you for reading out the title, so I don't have to. Essentially, I'm going to use up my 10 minutes, possibly less, in commenting on the title, which contains most of what I want to talk about, except for the overall topic, which is the relationship between the act and the object or target of genocidal politics, by which I mean pre- and post-genocidal symbolic games orchestrated around nation, ethnicity, race, and religion, which are the four categories mentioned in the Genocidal Convention as constituting the potential groups that genocide can be committed against. Now, I'm approaching this in terms of three authors, Eric Wegelin, Ludwig Wittgenstein, and Jean-François Lyotard, whose contributions to the model I want to present overlap. And I will point out that Wittgenstein is largely there as a bridge between the other two. I'm more interested in what they have to say, and I'm just using him as a type of vanishing mediator, as Frederick Jameson would have said. Okay. Now, the essential thesis is that when dealing with the genocidal object, that is nation hyphen ethnicity hyphen race hyphen religion, and consequently, when dealing with genocide itself, we're not dealing with concepts. There aren't any real concepts that correspond to these terms. We're dealing with symbols. And that involves us in a very, very different, very different types of activity, even when we think we're dealing with concepts. The proof of this, if one likes, is when one goes to the commentaries on the Genocide Convention, when one looks at, for example, the great work of William Schabas, who's one of the leading theorists of genocide and of the and commentators on the conventions, they're very explicit in their whole discussion of how the convention was drawn up and how the various groups were proposed, and that they actually can't work out. At the time, they couldn't work out quite clearly, but now we can work out even less clearly what these terms refer to. What is a nation? How does it differ from an ethnicity? Is race at all acceptable anymore as even a quasi-concept? How does this relate to a religious group if the religious group is not also a racial group, or an national group, or an ethnic group, and so forth? And again, the question in religious studies has come up as to whether or not a religion even exists anymore. Can we talk about a religion in conceptual terms anymore either? Insofar as when applying the term religion to other faith groups, we end up essentializing them in Christian terms. So the object is itself not conceptually determined, and that makes it difficult to determine what exactly genocide is if we don't know how to determine the groups that it applies to. And the leading scholars in this area are very clear that these are conceptual aporias. These are areas in which confusion reigns and where it's very difficult to come to any form of resolution and proper definition. Now, the other side of this is nobody's really confused as to whether or not a particular group qualifies, but they accept that they're doing it by the seat of their pants on a case-by-case basis, and this is even reflected in the actual rulings of the various tribunals and courts. As Schabas quotes an OSCE official who was riffing on what was once said by an American judge about pornography. I may not be able to define it, but I know it when I see it. And the OSCE official was saying the same about the nation or the genocidal target, that I may not be able to define it properly, but I know it when I see it. And of course, that's part of the question. How does that work? Now, interestingly enough, there has actually been, when it comes to setting up cases and tribunals, there's been relatively little dispute as to whether or not the target group is a target of a genocide. and there's a tendency to err outside the definition rather than to exclude people. Chabas himself suggests that you take the four key you take the four terms, and that you basically use them as poles around which fence around an overlapping area, and so that you use them in order to construct your object on a case-by-case basis by just using each of them as a type of delimiter. Now, part of what I got ahead of myself there slightly in terms of what I wanted to say, and so I'm now going to go back to what I think Voegelin and the others have to tell us about this. First of all, for Voegelin, Voegelin consistently through his work, Voegelin was a German-American political scientist writing from the 1930s through to the 1980s, and he, through his work, he consistently pointed out that there are very, very few actual concepts in political science, because concepts are the result of elaborated work. Most of what we see as concepts are symbols. Okay, that political symbols are in play, and most political science, most political scientific discourse is in fact a discourse in the deployment of symbols, not a discourse in the elaboration of scientific concepts. Now, he was still working with a wissenschaftliche idea and so forth, but overall, what this implies to us, when he's talking about symbols, what he means is he's not saying something bad. He's saying, in his view, all experience is mediated through symbols. Symbols are developed by traditions. Those traditions have to create ways of expressing our experience of the cosmos, of the divine ground, of being, of what man is and of what society is, and relating them all together. This can be done in terms of what he refers to as primary reality. Okay, and that is the, if you like, spontaneous symbolic expression of a society built up over time through tradition. And then there is what he refers to in modernity as secondary reality, which is the distortion of this, the cutting off. As he says, the human is contracted into the self. The self becomes something like Taylor's buffered self. It becomes the individual who is cut off from society and from God, the divine ground, and so becomes autonomous and self-determining, and therefore the subject of ideologies. Ideologies are the primary form of secondary reality, and they are not inhabited by concepts, they are inhabited by instrumentalized symbols. Okay, and of course, amongst the key forms of this second reality for Voegelin are the instrumentalization of the symbols of nation and of race. And in a couple of books from the 1930s, he analyzes these symbols of how the race idea in Germany was developed, and the symbol, how it comes from the Leib idea, the body idea, which is the idealized, spiritualized body idea of the Germans, and how that is related to the idea of the tribal body, the tribe through blood, the tribe is as derived from blood, and so on. That these are all symbols, not concepts. The very idea that we talk about blood relationship tells us we're dealing with a symbolic structure and not a conceptual one, because blood has nothing, absolutely nothing to do with it. So that the race idea for him is developed out of these symbolic elements, which are combined into what is a distorted second reality. For that distorted second reality, there is a counter idea, because in order for the Nordic race idea to be developed, you have to have a counter idea, and that is, of course, the Jew as the counter idea, as the racial counter idea. It's also worth pointing out at this point, noting, I think, that Voegelin identified two other particular symbols when he was talking about this contrast, and those are the symbol of the total state and the symbol of the authoritarian state. He coined the idea of the authoritarian state, and he points out that, and he's with the total state, he's obviously talking about Carl Schmitt. So that his idea here is that these are not political concepts. These are not political science concepts. These are symbols which are deployed in quasi-conceptual discourse that is pretending to be political science. Okay, now, if we can see what he's talking about there, and for Voegelin, symbols are both images and what he calls language symbols, sprachsymbol. So symbols here have to be understood in a wider sense than just images, but they are grounded in images for the most part. If we then move quickly to Wittgenstein, what we find is that Wittgenstein agrees to a certain extent here in that we have his idea of language games. Okay, and I'm going to pass, and language games are determined by their rules. Words are as words do. We no longer have conceptual definitions. He drops that when he moves on from the Tractatus to the philosophical investigations. We no longer have clear conceptual definitions. We have to learn the rules of the game and how the symbols are deployed. The how is as important as the what. Okay, and so that's very similar to what, in my view, that's very similar to what Wittgenstein, to what Voegelin was telling us about how we have to analyze how political symbols work, and particularly how they work in distorted frameworks. And finally, moving on to Lyotard, in his book, The Differend, he takes Wittgenstein's language games, which I would convert into symbolic games, okay? And he investigates the ways in which systematic distortion applies through the creation, what he terms phrase regimens and discursive genres. Okay, each statement in a given situation is a phrase. Phrases are governed by the rules of that phrase regimen, and then there are also the rules of the genre of the discursive genre. Okay, and when he talks about the differend, what he is saying is that under most circumstances, you can either have a dialogical structure or the structure of the differend, and the structure of the differend is systematically distorted, like with the case of the double bind, in order to put one party into a subordinate position, in order to create a victim out of one party. And victimhood is not a question of being wronged, and not a question of having something, of having suffered something. Okay. Not a question of having suffered something, it is a question of having, of being silenced, of being placed in a position where the rules of the game are set up for you and your identity is created as an effect of the system to a large extent, and that tells you how you can and cannot respond. And that, of course, brings us back to the question of genocide and nation and the constitutive exception. Okay, for Lyotard, the constitutive exception is created through the name as a rigid designator. This is the use of a term that doesn't have that has a referent in reality, but not a meaning, not a conceptual meaning. And for him, that is Auschwitz, which is that which cannot be thought, that which doesn't have a meaning, that which doesn't have that which no longer can be regulated within a conceptual or speculative context. That constitutive example is thus exceptional and put outside the system. In the same way as the Jew, for the system that Voegelin was analyzing of the Nordic body image and the race idea and so forth, is the constitutive example that defines the system by its exceptionalism and being put out of it. And I would suggest that for the European tradition, it is the people of Israel who function, the nation of Israel that functions as the constitutive exception for the system of nationhood, which is why we have, this is historically, the corpus mysticum Christi, the mystical body of Christ, which is the church, could only be constituted by the overcoming of the existence of the people of Israel and their scattering in the diaspora. So, if I can use a term like this Jew effect that is created by the system, that constitutes the Jew in the way that Sartre says the Jew is constituted by the other, and in the way that Goebbels, to use the most brutal form of it, says, on my watch, I decide who's the Jew. Okay, this is what is going on all the time in terms of the historic symbolic construct which we have inherited from the Christian construct, where the nation is the localized form of the corpus of the mystical body of Christ, mediated through the Christ-imitating king. Okay? This is one of the reasons, by the way, why I think that the Genocide Convention contains those 4 elements, because practically the only group to whom they all apply is, of course, the Jews. So that they become the constitutive exception of the Genocide Convention, because they are the only ones to whom it fully applies, and all other genocides must therefore be placed under the name of Auschwitz, which itself cannot be understood. Okay, that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you very much, Desmond. We have been quite liberal with the time, but given that we will not have Nerin Dizdar speaking today, I would like to turn to Keith Dowd. Professor Dowd, you are going to speak about the rejection of interfaith kumstvo in Njegoš the Mountain Reed and Vuk Drašković's Nož.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to use share screen, so I'll try to set that up. Okay, can we see this okay? Okay. The Mountain Wreath is considered a masterpiece of South Slavic literature, and for years was required reading in all schools in former Yugoslavia. Drašković's Knife was published in 1982 before the war and quickly became a popular bestseller, more popular than other Serbian authors. Both works, literary works, narrate violence and hatred so as to sensationalize violence and hatred. Both works preach a gospel of hatred. In each work, hatred becomes the highest religion. The 2 works are thus exasperating to read and at times nauseating, in fact, painful to read. I want to focus on a point that Michael Sells makes. The grotesque killing of innocent and defenseless human beings deflects our attention from another kind of violence depicted in each work. This other kind of violence is a cultural violence, and the target of this cultural violence is interfaith kumstvo. A respected kinship heritage among South Slavs. So Milenko Filipović wrote that ritual kinship of various forms was of great importance among South Slavs in the past because it widened the circle of relatives beyond the family, beyond the clan, beyond the tribe. Well, this is true not only in the past, but also in the present, particularly in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Filipović also noted that interfaith kumstvo happens frequently in polyethnic societies. Since you're familiar with the different types of kumstvo, I won't go through them because I want to focus on how this is a feature of these 2 literary works, which I'll discuss today. This literary masterpiece, The Mountain Wreath, is also a hymn for Serbian nationalism, glorifying hatred of Slavic Muslims and murderous violence against them. Michael Sells interprets the work as a nihilistic poem promoting genocide. It's set in Montenegro. The Slavic Muslim community is confronted with the threat of extinction if they do not convert to Serbian Orthodoxy. The Orthodox Serbs say the only choice for their Muslim neighbors is between baptism of water and baptism of blood, which is just murder, wanton murder masked with hateful religiosity. Taking the high road, if you will, the Slavic Muslims point out that there's another choice. There's a better choice. They offer a kum ceremony, a cultural custom the Slavic Muslims and Orthodox Serbs share as South Slavs. This kum ceremony is something like what today we call restorative justice. It's a process to resolve conflict and hostility and establish peace. The Orthodox Serbs vehemently reject this offer and then slaughter the Muslim men, women, and children in their community, their neighbors. The mountain wreath foreshadows not only the ethnic violence in the recent war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but other pogroms throughout Balkan history. So it's helpful to look at some passages in Serbian from the mountain wreath, because in the English translations, kum and kumovi are not translated at all. They're kind of ignored and sort of erased and sort of deleted from the translation. And so for foreigners like myself, it's difficult to pick up on this particular aspect of the narrative. But you can see here, Yachu prvi bochi pred kumama. So basically, the point I want to make is that the nationalistic awakening of the Serbian people follows from the rejection of the offer of interfaith ritual kinship. The Orthodox Serbs in this work destroyed not only a Slavic Muslim community, but also the habits of the heart of South Slavs. The rejection is the poem's prelude to the violence against the Bosniaks in Montenegro. The violent actions, though, were not as predetermined as the Orthodox Serbs asserted. Not only could things have been otherwise, but things were historically otherwise. The violence in this work is sadistic, not because the relationship between the Slavic Muslims and Orthodox Serbs in Montenegro were distant, but because the relations were close and intimate and culturally renewable. Now I want to turn to Drasković's knife. Drasković is a leading nationalist politician in Belgrade. He was a close ally of Šešelj, and you all know this far better than I do. I don't really know his history or politics that much. He's from Bosnia, a Bosnian Serb. The novel which he wrote takes place during World War II. It begins with a gruesome, sadistic killing of a Serbian family by a neighboring Muslim family, where the Muslim family were kumovi to the Serbian family. The violence is sensationally depicted in an incendiary manner. The context of the massacre is pivotal. When the kum enters the Serbian home as the family celebrated Christmas, the Muslim family blasphemed not only Christianity, but also the integrity of the ritual kinship which bonded the Serbian and Muslim families. Before the massacre, the Serbian patriarch trusted and honored his Muslim patron. The Muslim family, though, sarcastically used the terms for kum and kumovi to refer to their Serbian ritual kin before massacring the family. Drasković's motive is to kill any trust or confidence Bosnians would have in interfaith kunstvoh. Drasković's poison is throughout the novel. It is not the physical violence per se that evokes his gospel of hatred. It's the violence against interfaith spiritual kinship which evokes his gospel of hatred. So I'd like to draw attention to Kenneth Burke, a communication scholar and rhetorician. Before World War II, he wrote a rhetorical analysis of Hitler's Mein Kampf. In this work, he says, this book by Hitler, Mein Kampf, is the well of Nazi magic, crude magic, but effective. So the point I want to make is that the mountain wreath and knife are the well of Serbian nationalist magic. By igniting the flames of insatiable hatred, the incendiary works stir up interfaith tensions. Drasković cut deeply into the interfaith, interconnecting kinship fabric that held Bosnia and Herzegovina together throughout its history. And to conclude, I'd like to draw attention to the work Waiting for Elijah, Time and Encounter in Bosnian Landscape. Safed Haji Muhamedovic criticizes Eugene Hamel's classic anthropological study of Kumstvo, titled Alternative Social Structures and Ritual Kinships. It's a classic work in anthropology. He criticizes Hamel for devoting only one paragraph to interfaith Kumstvo. Hamel argued in his work that Kumstvo is longer lasting and more stable when Kumstvo is between like and like, when it's ethnically homogeneous. Haji Muhamedovic argues, in contrast, that when Kumstvo is between like and unlike, ethnically heterogeneous, it is deeper and more authentic. Haji Muhamedovic explains interethnic ritual kinship as a contract of intimacy with the other. And so this focuses, how can I say this? It's difficult for foreigners like myself to understand the tragedy of Bosnia. I offer this paper as a window through which to see more, hopefully more clearly and more critically, the tragedy of Bosnia. So, hvala puno na pozivu, drago mi je da sam ovdje sa vama, radujem se da mogu vidjeti svoje kolege. Gotov sam.
Thank you, Professor Dowd. This has been quite intriguing, interesting as well, and I'm sure we'll be able to debate it for a while. Let me just ask now Desmond Maurer to read the presentation of Almir Bašović, who unfortunately could not be here today. The title of his paper is Cultural Memory in Javad Karahasan's novel Nocturnal Council. Desmond?
Yes, yep.
Are you ready?
I'm ready. Okay. Even with considerably more time than here envisaged, it would be difficult to present all the aspects of cultural memory to be found in Javad Karahasan's Nocturnal Council, Nočno Vijeće, or give due consideration to all of the ways in which the novel is connected to important ideas that have made a significant contribution to our understanding of the past and to questions of identity within European culture. Instead, I shall just run through a few of the links that connect Nocturnal Council to the phenomena of remembrance and memory as defined by Jan Assmann in his book Cultural Memory and Early Civilization, Writing, Remembrance and Political Imagination, and by his wife Aleida Assmann in her book Shadows of Trauma, Memories and Politics of Post-War Identity. In brief, the Assmanns distinguish between memory as a subjective individual psychological phenomenon and memory that is a collectively shaped phenomenon. Regarding cultural memory, as that which we must not forget, Jan Assmann has written, cultural memory then focuses on fixed points in the past, but again, it is unable to preserve the past as it was. This tends to be condensed into symbolic figures to which memory attaches itself. For example, tales of the patriarchs, the Exodus, wandering in the desert, conquest of the promised land, exile, and that are celebrated in festivals and are used to explain current situations. Myths are also figures of memory, and here any distinction between myth and history is eliminated. What counts for cultural memory is not factual, but remembered history. One might even say that cultural memory transforms factual into remembered history, thus turning it into myth. End of quote. All Karahasan's novels stand in opposition to the current literary fashion, which may be associated with remembering subjectivity and an insistence on individuality as a singular ideal of Western culture. His Nocturnal Council is written in the third person, using a narrative technique that we might associate with what Franz Stanzel has called the personal narrative situation. Its characteristics are an illusion of narrative immediacy, with the events mediated through the feelings and associations of a character. While Stanzel says of the personal novel that as a genre, it is closest to dramatic mimesis. It's a novel that aspires to the form of objectivity characteristic of drama. In his Book of Gardens, Karahasan cites as his ideal a statement by a medieval actor to the effect that I have represented people birds, animals, and meteorological phenomena so well that they have each of them expressed themselves by means of my voice. This aspiration of Kara Hassan speaks to his attempt to achieve the highest possible degree of objectivity in his novels, as well as to his desire for the novel, as with classical art, to be shaped and expressive of the events and characters, the things from which the book is made up. Another thing that connects Kara Hassan's Nocturnal Council with the classical form of narrative is the way he puts center stage. Who has a choice to make, insofar as classical literature always offers us an image of the free individual on the grounds that the individual is never entirely determined by something outside him or herself. So, Kara Hassan places the character of Simon Mihailovic at the center of his novel. He is a Serb who, in 1991, just before the war in Bosnia had begun, has returned to his native town of Foča after 25 years, leaving his wife Barbara and his son Sasha back in Germany. Simon's return is followed by the murders of certain people close to him. And the structure of the novel is significantly informed by the parallelism between his daily interrogations at the police station at the hands of his former PE teacher, who is convinced that Simon has come back to help his people in the approaching war, on the one hand, and his nocturnal conversations with his friend Enver, on the other. The family home to which Simon has returned begins to behave in strange ways. Some doors cannot be opened, mirrors darken, strange creaking is heard, and there is an intense scent of walnut. At the end of the novel, Simon goes down into the basement and finds a berzah, a space occupied by dead Muslims or Bosniaks who had suffered terrible deaths over the previous century and whose souls were now stuck between two worlds. In order to be able to find final peace, these souls tell Simon of their fate and expect him to kill them in his imagination, in the same way as they've already been killed in external reality. Simon cannot kill the souls, but he cannot forget their testimony either, and so remains shut up with them in limbo. At the end, we find out that the entire story of Simon's arrival in Foča has in fact been being told by Simon's dead friend Enver to Simon's wife Barbara during a night in Simon and Barbara's apartment in Berlin. Perfectly in accord with the organic treatment of art in the tradition of classical poetics, and equally perfectly in accord with the importance that Kara Hassan gives to the theme of doomed lovers in almost all of his novels, Nocturnal Council ends with Barbara walking through a Berlin park, where at precisely the time that Simon is descending into the berzah, she encounters a gust of wind bearing leaves that brings on an orgasm as a sign of her final encounter with her husband. As a novel, Nocturnal Council displays all the characteristics of cultural memory as that which we must not forget. As Jan Assmann says, cultural memory requires place, and Kara Hassan has literally constructed the place of the berzah as a place of remembrance of the violent crimes against generations of Bosnian Muslims in eastern Bosnia. Cultural memory is focused on fixed points in the past, and Kara Hassan has selected those points in history, writing his novel as a novel of continuity, establishing parallels between horrendous but forgotten events in the past and the most recent pogrom against the Bosniaks in eastern Bosnia between 1990 and 1995, which would follow after the events described in the novel. Moreover, it is characteristics of remembrance that the past is concentrated in symbolic figures, and Kara Hassan makes these symbolic figures the central figures of his novel. Cultural memory is essentially something sacred, and again, Kara Hassan's novel is, in a certain way, also a discussion of fundamental questions of a world that has lost its inner form and become oblivious to the question of the sacred. Nocturnal Council is perhaps the most contemporary of Kara Hassan's novel, as the novel in which history is most intensely present. We might connect the role of the witness to history in this novel, of the witness to history in this novel, Simon, with the literally speaking current dimension of Nocturnal Council. Simon's choice presents the reader with a series of rather horrifying questions as to whether or not the trauma of history can be overcome through witness of the sort that historiography has been offering us now for centuries. Does history repeat as a nightmare precisely because it lacks the form of witness that serious literature requires of us, namely witness that engages all the levels of our being? In a world in which being objective has become confused with being interested and distant, being disinterested and distant, uninterested and distant, are we even capable of real witness anymore? We can connect pretty much all these aspects of his novel through the thoughts of Aleida Assmann. This author also writes about dimensions that complement historiography from the perspective of memory, not least emphasizing the dimensions of emotion and individual experience, the memorial function, and ethical orientation. Writing about individual memory, Assmann points out that memories are built and reinforced through communication, through linguistic exchange with others, in which it is difficult not to recognize the situation from Nocturnal Council, where the victims are desperately anxious to exchange their memories of their horrific destinies with Simon. Moreover, Assmann warns of the power of memory as that which makes people human, and points out that biographical memories are necessary material for the building of experiences, relations, and especially our own identity images. As a further characteristic, she notes that such remembrances are perspectival, so that thanks to each person's individual life story, they possess their own place in terms of a specific point of view or focalization, which is something we are prepared for by the specific point of view of Simon Mihailovich, who subtly reminds us that our own individuality might not be possible without a collective memory already existing as a cultural product. According to Assmann, transition from individual to collective memory is achieved by participation rituals within which past events are interpreted, communicated, and worked on to keep them current. The currency for which Simon decides in Nocturnal Council is horrifying, but equally horrifying is how Kara Hassan uses Simon's case to show us subtly how we as a culture have forgotten to what degree our individuality and our membership of the collective are not just given, but actually depend to an enormous degree on our own active engagement. To sum up, if this is an appropriate place to do so, it is worth noting that the current political events in Bosnia and Herzegovina have given Kara Hassan's novel an appalling currency. The denial of genocide has become a type of political platform, so that there are people present on the political scene here who have no problem whatsoever with killing the victims symbolically all over again. Unlike Kara Hassan's Simon, these people have clearly little capacity for empathy or indeed for individuality. This raises an important question as to whether we as a society and a culture are, unlike Kara Hassan's Simon, who makes a very clear ethical choice, stuck and imprisoned in an eternal yesterday. Jan Assmann considers the phenomenon of remembrance of the dead, the cult of the dead, to be the origin and heart of what a culture of memory should be. Defining cultural memory as relationship to a past that only comes into being when we ourselves can consciously differentiate between yesterday and today, Assmann says death is the primordial experience of such differentiation, and remembrance of the dead, the primordial form of cultural memory. Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Desmond, for reading the Almir Bashevich's paper. Obviously, it's quite an intriguing analysis of Javad Kara Hassan's work. And now I have to say that we are just in time for a discussion that can follow for the next 20 minutes, perhaps a little bit more. So if there is anybody who would like to pose a question, please use the chat option. I wonder if any of the participants would like to ask anything in particular. I would then like to use, before anybody poses a question through chat, I would like to ask Professor Goldstein something. Okay, I see. Okay, Rusmir has a question or comment, so I will give Rusmir
a
chance to pose a question. Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you to everybody for these presentations. Professor Goldstein, thank you very much for this important presentation of important topics. I have a question for you. You know that during this period after Second World War, monoparty and ideological homogeneity deprived public space from, let's say, discussions on key questions and fetishized, dogmatized, tabooized questions. Among questions was anti-Semitism. In my view, can you hear me, please? Huh? Professor Goldstein, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. I hope that I will understand the question anyway.
My question is, in my reading of Travnička Hronika, this, if you can remember, presentation of Atias to French Council is anti-Semitic. If you can end in which Ivan Andrić was writing this novel in Belgrade, witnessing persecution, killings, Jews, but at the same time he is presenting that the problem of Jews are Bosnian Muslims. This inversion, which is quite obvious, in which Atias was seeing, we are living here in this horrific situation in the darkness, and so please tell to the people on the West on our situation and so on. It is written just as inversion of that, what was happening in Belgrade during Second World War. It is, in my view, anti-Semitic. And I could list similar cases after Second World War that were not discussed at all as anti-Semitic, but they were essential. What you would say about that?
Well, can you hear me now? Can
Yes.
you hear me? Well, thank you. Thank you for, first of all, Professor Matko Čehaj for the organizing this conference. About the question, I'm not a specialist in Andrić, so I was fascinating reading his works. Nevertheless, as I say, I'm not a specialist. And I don't want to discuss his views, particularly after we heard certain things. We have here specialists for Andrić and for that kind of things. Speaking about anti-Semitism, of course, as you said, we didn't speak about anti-Semitism during the war, after the war, when it was the time to speak, and at least at the time to start to speak, because we were living in socialistic Yugoslavia, in which there were certain, at least not taboo themes, but there were certain things we would suggest or like not to be discussed. We were living in a country which was not able to confront with its own history for many years, and particularly not the national relations. Serbs confronting the Muslims, Bosniaks, Serbs and Croats, Croats and Muslims. So as I have a couple of minutes just to say something, I would say that from the beginning is wrong to see the behavior of a certain national or ethnic or religious group in the Second World War as being a collective. In any nation from 41 to 45, there were millions of individuals who were reacting in a different way. So saying that the Croats or Serbs or Muslims in those times, Bosniaks, were reacting or this or that way is from the beginning essentially wrong. There were many reactions which were consequence of a reality, many reactions from individuals from a respective nation. So speaking about the Bosniaks in 1941 or Croats or Serbs as being a collective and reacting in the same manner is from the beginning the wrong position, the wrong way of thinking. There was no unilateral, unique reaction. Within each nation, there were collaborators, there were traitors. In the same time, there were people, honorable people, and people who were at some point taking weapons and fighting the enemy. It seems to me that the Holocaust, I'm sure that the Holocaust was not presented in the 50s, in the 60s, in a manner which should have been presented. But it's also the tragedy of each nation, 41, 45, we had impression that it was not presented in the right way. It deserved to be presented on one hand. On the other hand, we know that the regime, socialistic regime, I don't want to blame, I don't want to neglect the responsibility of the socialistic regime. But socialistic regime, led by Tito, thought that we should avoid speaking about the tragedies, about the mass crimes. We should speak about our successes, our development, our things which was achieved. In that way, we would be able to overcome these problems. That's what I can tell you in a couple of minutes, and thank you for the question.
Thank you very much, Professor Goldstein. Paul Bamford raised his hand, so please, Paul, unmute if you want to pose a question.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hello, do you hear me? Yeah. Do you see me? Yeah, I hope so. So I just wanted to raise some comments about what has just been said. I wanted first to remind, because maybe there has been some ambiguity, that unfortunately anti-Semitism is not the privilege of a specific nation, and it's not restricted to a specific period of history, but it's much more structural, and it's constitutive of the structure of politics. And the question should be, or would be, the question of politics. Apart from this, I just wanted to add some points to what Desmond had said before. I very much liked his use of symbols in his talk, and I totally agree with this. With the transformation of language into symbols plays a very important role in the reshaping of language, and especially in political language. But maybe even this term or this concept of symbol should be pushed a little bit further, as to rethink the totality of the political language that has been invented indeed during the Nazi period, and that is nowadays used everywhere. I would say that the political language in modernity, in our late modernity, is Nazi, or is the heritage of Nazi use of language and the shift of language. The second thing I wanted to raise about this, let me see if I can see. I would be very cautious about what can be taken from Wittgenstein and all this logic of proposition that is based on the idea of wanting to say something, and wanting to say something since there is a want to do something. So this wanting to say, this wanting to do, has all to do, of course, with the question of will, and supposes, how could I say, a leading principle that could rule and dominate expressions, forms of society, how could I say, organization of society, and so on. Briefly said, it really requires the constitution of a metaphysical subject that we know very well since Descartes, and that has been how could I say, very profoundly shaken by late modernity. And in this respect, I was a little bit confused with what has been said about the constitution and the fabrication of the victim. I think here again, we have the repetition of this typical metaphysical understanding that is linked with the idea of a performative language that can be the expression of a will that therefore can be turned towards good or towards evil. I think it's very, very misleading. In other terms, if the victim is selected by strategies, by political strategies, I would say the victim is twice victim. It is a second time negated. It is negated with the crime, with the extermination, and it is negated by being targeted willingly through a structure of decision that is, again, a political decision. I think this is misleading, and this doesn't help understanding the question, the main question for us in the West, which is very simple. Why the Jews? Why always the Jews? Why always the Jews? That's the question. So there is something to do with the Jews that doesn't belong simply to a sovereign decision achieved through mastering language. And it should be thought, in my opinion, much further. And it should, how could I say, go through a very radical deconstruction and critics of this Christian assumption that finally the victim is necessarily innocent. And because, as you know, this pure innocence of the victim, and therefore the pure victim of which the condition is to be purely innocent, is precisely the rhetoric that constructs the whole theology of incarnation and the whole justification of Jesus. And this is playing a major role, excuse me, precisely in anti-Semitism. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Paul. Let me see if there is anybody who would like to respond or comment on anything that was said here before. Desmond has a word. Please, Desmond, unmute.
Okay. First of all, hello, Paul, and thank you for your comments. And I'd first like to say that as I mentioned, I was using Wittgenstein largely to get to Lyotard, because some of the things that he says in the different seem to me useful, and he does try explicitly to undercut the role of the metaphysical subject in the creation of the phrasing regimen and so forth. And while I certainly don't yet understand what everything he's trying to say, or the debates which he was being part of, which of course included La Coulabarth and Nancy and so forth, and have precisely to do with the things that Paul was just talking about how the Nazi language and Nazi symbolism constitute the political. And for La Coulabarth, for example, that the Nazis were in fact paradigmatic of the modern political, as opposed to a distortion of it. But I'm at this stage learning. What I'm glad to see is his acceptance or his agreement is confirmation that that we really are talking about structures and structural the structural generation of effects, and that does bring up really the question of why the Jew, when it's clearly not something to do with the Jewish people themselves or Jewish individuals or Jewish tradition itself from the inside. It's got to do with the creation of an effect. And here I actually would like to ask Professor Goldstein to comment on something as well, and that is he mentioned that an author who commented that, you know, the Yugoslav peoples hated each other enough that they didn't need the Jews, and yet he pointed out, I mean, one of the first things I remember in 1995 in being in Split, well, 1995, 1996 being in Split, was seeing the protocols of the Elders of Zion on open sale in the in Diocletian's palace. And so the question is, what causes the continuation of the use of anti-Semitism and the use of the image or the of the Jew in context where there is no real Jewish presence? I can think of my own homeland, Ireland, where there was never a large Jewish community, but where anti-Semitism played a large cultural role. Sorry, that.
Can you hear me now? Thank you, Desmond, for the question. There is a concept in many countries all over the world. One would mention sometimes Japan, for example, where we are speaking about the anti-Semitism without the Jews. In former Yugoslav countries, throughout these last 2 or 3 decades, from time to time, one mentions, for example, so-called Jewish lobby. Jewish lobby, what did the Jewish lobby do in a particular or concrete situation? There were no Jews at all. Jewish lobby did something in The Hague or influenced certain American or British or, I don't know, French politics. Even Israel is not involved in any case. Why the Jews? I mean, why the Jews? Why anti-Semitism? It stems, speaking about the Christian or Muslim tradition, it stems from a particular position of the Jews in the Christian society. We speak about Christianity. Jews were for centuries the only minority in both Eastern and Western Europe. Religious, ethnic, they were the others. And of course, there is a traditional problem with the Jews as being treated as murderers of Christ. In the same time, in the Muslim society, the Jews were once one of the nations of the book, Al-Kitab. Nevertheless, from time to time, there was a certain, there were persecutions in the Muslim societies as well, not so often, but there were. And certainly there is an ideological basis. So today, what we are, as I said, if you have a bad or political situation which creates enemies by its very nature, then you will have here or there anti-Semitic incidents, outbursts, and unfortunately, it is logical. Certain people think that nationalism or chauvinism is some kind of aberration of a normal political situation. I don't think so. Nationalism is a natural product of a political situation. And you have nationalism all over the place throughout history. 19th, 20th century. I'm dealing with modern and contemporary history. We see it. It's not some kind of aberration. People started to think in a different or illogical or irrational way. Nationalism, maybe, well, we can discuss whether racial anti-Semitism is, or nationalism, and then anti-Semitism is rational or irrational. But this is some kind of, this is a completely different discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't see any more hands. So I would like at this point to thank you all for your presentations, and once again to International Forum Bosnia to making this possible. We will have a break now of 10 minutes, and at 3:30, the next panel will start. Thank you.
Very much. Thank you, everybody.
Third and final. I'd like to welcome everybody back to the third and final panel on genocide, nation, and state. We have 6 speakers envisaged, and as everybody is aware, each speaker has approximately 10 minutes. As was done to me while I was speaking, I will send a message if you, I will send a message in the chat if you go over the 10 minutes, asking you to just wrap up in a couple of minutes. Okay, our first speaker was also our inaugural lecturer, and he is now speaking on a topic which he is unfortunately very at home with, genocide in Bosnia. So Marko Attila Hor, Professor Hor, please take the stand.
Thank you very much. So this presentation is about genocide in Bosnia, and as Desmond said, it's something I've spent a lot of time studying and thinking about almost my entire adult life, and I hope to write a book about it in the near future. Can't really do justice to the subject, obviously, in 10 minutes, but I wanted to perhaps to highlight some of the main issues for any discussion of genocide in Bosnia. So one of the sort of the questions that's posed by, we talk about the genocide in Bosnia, the Bosnian genocide, is which group was being targeted for destruction, or what was being targeted for destruction. So as we all know, genocide, according to the UN Convention, involves the intent to destroy a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group in whole or in part. And in the case of the Bosnian genocide, the group, as it were, principally targeted for destruction were the Bosniaks. The genocide intended to leave them effectively stateless and destroy their culture and heritage wherever they were found. Croats were also targeted for destruction by the Serb perpetrators, and to some extent even Serbs, anti-nationalist Serbs or Serbs married to Croats and Bosniaks. But Croat nationalists were also viewed as partners by the Serb nationalists for the destruction of Bosnia in a way which Bosniak nationalists weren't. So there is a certain difference between how Croats and how Bosniaks were targeted in the genocide, and that's a nuance that has to be addressed. Nevertheless, even the Bosniaks were not targeted for physical extermination to the extent that some other genocide victims have been in the past, such as the Jews in the Holocaust or the Tutsis in Rwanda, where there was a much greater intent to kill every member of the group. That wasn't really the case in the Bosnian genocide. And that's one reason why the ICTY has failed to convict anyone of genocide outside of Srebrenica. So in this case, the attempt to destroy the group on Serb-held territory involved forced expulsion, so-called ethnic cleansing, and cultural destruction. But what I think is really important to emphasize is it wasn't just this national group, the Bosniaks, who were targeted for destruction. What was targeted for destruction was the land of Bosnia, the state of Bosnia, and the common life or coexistence of the Bosnian peoples. And this cannot be really understood if you just stick to a narrow definition of genocide as targeting a particular ethnic or national group. So what was being the state that had been built up since the Second World War, the Bosnian Republic was being destroyed, the country was being destroyed, the ability of Serbs, Croats, and Bosniaks to coexist was being destroyed. Hence the targeting of Sarajevo in the siege as the capital of this state of Bosnia, and the destruction of the Bosnian government building, the National Library, the Oriental Institute, and so forth. So I think we need to sort of think about an understanding of genocide that goes beyond a narrow focus simply on an ethnic group or national group that was being destroyed. And particularly important also to emphasize cultural genocide, which isn't part of the UN's definition, but was Raphael Lemkin believed in the concept of cultural genocide, and that's a major part of what the genocide was about, destroying the culture of the group and how the group's coexistence with other groups. So a second important thing to consider is the question of aggression versus civil war. So, and both these dimensions have to be understood. So genocide was on the one hand organized by the regime of Slobodan Milosevic in the neighboring state of Serbia, based in Belgrade, and involved an act of aggression by the state of Serbia against the state of Bosnia. But it was also this element of civil war in the sense that the part of the Bosnian population, above all Serbs, were mobilized to kill and persecute their non-Serb neighbors, particularly Bosniaks. And a feature of this genocide that made it different from the Holocaust, for example, was the fact that Bosniaks in Serb concentration camps, such as Omarska, for example, often found themselves being guarded and persecuted by many of their own former neighbors, colleagues, even friends. And the political leadership to these Serb perpetrators in Bosnia was given by the Serb Democratic Party, or Srpska Demokratska Stranka, which was an indigenous Bosnian political party that many Bosnian citizens voted for, even if it was subordinated to Belgrade's policies. So these aspects of civil war and interstate aggression have to be reconciled, and the historian understanding the genocide needs to look at both the factors within Bosnia, within Serbia, and in relation between Serbia, Bosnia, and the rest of Yugoslavia. And if we extend this, we can also say we also have to look at the Croat dimension, the role of Bosnian Croats in the genocide, the role of Tudjman's Croatia in the genocide, and beyond that, the role of the international community, the Western powers and the UN, who also facilitated the genocide. So we're talking about an analysis of the genocide that has to take place at multiple levels. It's a complex thing to explain. Another factor that needs to be considered, another aspect of the question, is this question of short-term, medium-term, and long-term causes. So on the one hand, we have to avoid the purely determinist approach that treats the genocide as historically inevitable, the result of long-term factors, so-called, which tends towards the stereotype of ancient ethnic hatreds, as if the Bosnian peoples were naturally prone to kill each other. And the opposite, a reductionist approach that reduces everything to short-term political factors. So you have to sort of, on the one hand, we have to explain the short-term political factors that led the Serb leaders, both in Serbia and in Bosnia, to embark upon genocide, but also the long-term historical or structural factors that conditioned the choices they made. So if we're looking at the long-term structural factors, we can think about the historical relationship between Serbs and Bosniaks in Bosnia, conditioned by the legacy of the Ottoman Empire, the historic class relationship between Muslim landlords and Serb peasants under the Ottomans, the differences in national ideology between Bosnian Serbs and Bosniaks, the competition for the control of office between Serb and Bosniak political parties. Other factors of a changing balance of power, which I think is important, the fact that Serbs were the largest group in Bosnia at the end of the Second World War, and they dominated the new state established in the Second World War by the partisans, but then there's a shift in power towards the Bosniaks during the post-war period under the communists, when Bosniaks overtook Serbs as the most numerous nation in Bosnia, and Serbs lost their hegemony over the state, but remained strong in the security forces. Another important factor was the recognition of Muslims as they were then known as a nation in 1968, which ended the possibility of Muslim or Bosniak assimilation into the Serb or Croat nations. And I think also to mention here the gender factor, the fact that under Tito there was this emancipation of women, this kind of overturning of patriarchal society, women going into the workplace within this new Bosnian state and society, and the kind of the mass rapes that took place were, to some extent, an expression against that, kind of a backlash against this modernizing emancipation of women. Obviously, you have to look at the historical state policy of Serbia. So Serbia's historic policy of expansionism, which is kind of one level is obvious, really, that Serbia has traditionally wanted to expand to include neighboring territories, but at the same time, it wasn't always genocidal. So it's difficult to find evidence that someone like Ilya Garashanin, for example, Garashanin's 1844 blueprint or plan, it wasn't a genocidal text. He didn't call for genocide against Muslims or Bosniaks. So something changed in Serbia's ideology. In the medium-term factors, Serbia's relationship within the Yugoslav Federation, the fact that Serbia had been hegemonic in the interwar period and to some extent in the early years of Tito regime, but then Serbia lost its leadership within Yugoslavia. And within Serbia, the failure of Serbian liberalism. Milivoj Beslin, a very interesting younger historian from Serbia, argues that 1972 was a key turning point that led to the war, because in 1972, Latinka Pelovic's Serbian liberals were defeated and purged, and that set Serbia along an authoritarian path that then could not be turned away from the sort of the eventual war and pursuit of nationalist aggression. We need to understand the Milosevic regime, the anti-bureaucratic revolution, why it was that Milosevic's regime, which is based upon mass nationalist mobilization, ultimately had to find new enemies and new conflicts to sustain itself. So we have to understand that nature of that regime. And in the short term, then beyond that, why was it then in 1990, this policy of genocide decided upon in 1990, in the spring, the first half of 1990, that was the time when the Serbian leadership definitely decided upon the war to withdraw borders and create a greater Serbia. And some interesting questions. Why was there so little attempt to win Muslim collaborators? So why was so little effort made by the Serb perpetrators to find Muslims they could collaborate with? Was it because they didn't want them as collaborators, or was it because they couldn't win them? So Alija Izetbegović's unwillingness to ally himself or to collaborate with the Serb nationalists. Perhaps the priority was to mobilize Bosnian Serbs, and to mobilize Bosnian Serbs, you had to get them to attack Muslims. And this goes back to Milorad Ekmečic's thesis that the 1870s Bosnian uprising failed because it wasn't radically anti-Muslim enough. Effectively, it didn't radically embrace the Serb position against Muslim landlords. So that's another sort of interesting question of why the genocide took the form it did. And finally, just before I finish, to sort of touch upon this question of the evolution of genocide, and I would refer everyone, if you haven't, I'm sure you've read it already, but if you haven't read it, look at my colleague Edina Bećirović's groundbreaking work, Genocide in the Drina River, which explains the evolution of genocide from the form it took in 1992, with a comparatively small number of killings compared to what happened later, of all ages and genders, to the form of Srebrenica massacre, where you have every combat age male killed, much larger killing relatively, but not so many women and children killed. And this was also linked to the rise of the Bosnian army and Bosniak resistance when the Serb perpetrators were no longer facing defenseless Bosniak victims, but were now facing an organized Bosnian army. And so they could not afford to let Bosniak men go back onto the battlefield after being defeated and come back to fight them. So they wanted to kill every single combat age male off. You can compare this to how Nazi genocidal policy towards Jews was affected by what happened in the international sphere on the battlefield in relations between Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States. The evolution of Nazi genocide was also conditioned by events on the battlefield. So I hope that was possible to follow that, but I will end there. So thank you.
Thank you very much. With a certain symmetry, our next speaker is, in fact, Edina Bećirović.
Desmond, can I ask you a favor? Can somebody else go before? I was a little bit late. I had,
okay.
I had another event to attend. If it's okay, I'd like to go last today.
Yeah, I have no problem with that. That's
Okay.
fine. Okay.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is then should be Sonia Biserko. Is Sonia here? Right, doesn't appear to be. So in that case, I will ask Rusmir Mahmoud to talk on the essence and forms of genocidal ideology.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. We have a situation that genocide in Bosnia, genocide against Bosnia happened. And it cannot be changed. And we now have different perspectives on that what's happened. We can recognize very clearly elites behind the genocide, organization behind genocide, and executors, perpetrators of genocide. However, there is no possibility to have genocide without ideology, genocidal ideology. It is a necessary precondition, but it is not enough. The genocidal ideology is not sudden or stochastic appearance, happenings. It must be before the genocide happened, and the question is it, does it survive after genocide happened? During the 20th century, we didn't recognize presence and the contents of this genocidal ideology. And what it would be, because it is obviously, because genocide happened, it was present before, and as I could demonstrate, it is present now more actively than before genocide. What was a genocidal ideology in the case of Holocaust? We can speak quite clearly. So many researches, presentations, and so on, all over the world. But if we have genocide in Bosnia, if we had genocide in Bosnia, I must confess that ignorance about genocidal ideology has been prevailing within academia. Now we can hear all over the world and Bosnia, genocide, genocide, genocide in Bosnia. It became, in my view, plastic word of the language, and it became, in the same time, a reason for ideological targeting almost every discussion about the genocide in Bosnia. You know very well that Uwe Persson was trying to explain that in modernity and in postmodernity, of course, modular language in politics is prevalent. Plastic words are characteristic of modular language. As some people before were discussing about this genocide as a concept, genocide as a symbol, genocide as a legal norm, and so on. But each of these usages of term genocide could be located within different language games. We had mentioning, of course, these terms, or symbolic games, as Desmond said. Today, survivors of Bosnian genocide in Bosnia, are usually speaking about genocide. They found a kind of satisfaction that they can speak in this way about that. And of course, they're speaking about that. That is not speaking about concept of genocide, norm of genocide, and so on. They found this Hague Tribunal verdicts as a kind of, how to say, satisfying. They are looking for something, for a way out from their disparate situation, from their trauma. And of course, the term, the word, genocide for them is fully plastic. Negators of genocide are using just this situation of this kind of presentation of feelings, traumas, using the word of genocide, let's say, to strengthen their negations. They are strengthening links and the public presentation of genocidal ideology. If we would compare, let's say, this what Radovan Karadzic and, for example, Mladic were speaking before genocide happened, it was with more mimicry than today we can hear the same things about Bosnia, Bosnian people, Bosnian culture, Bosnian heritage, Bosnian Muslims especially, from Vučić, from Dodik, though they were usually speaking about peace, prosperity, establishing relations of the economic development in the region and so on. It is, if we would, let's say, take into account these 10 phases of genocide, starting from classification, we have now full open speech about, let's say, classification within the region, which is a view of the protectors of heritage of genocide. They too dare speak about Bosniaks fully outside of their Bosnian tradition, outside of the state, as a body that they are determining in the contents and in possible presentation, and fully outside of the state. In my view, plasticity of the word of the genocide can be identified, can be discovered in all speeches about within anti-Bosnian ideology, even in the different forms of self-hatred, Bosniaks and the Muslims. The using of this genocide sometimes is covering therefore responsibility for the real political, economic, social, psychological situation in which they are. What we have today is a Muslim presentation of their identity, and it is recycling the situation and the view on their own situation, their relation with the state, which is more than 100 years old. Nothing new, no within reform, no within these discussions about, let's say, the key dimension of their contemporary experience with a real genocide. If somebody would say that it is exaggeration, please, can we see any serious study about genocidal ideology that was present from the beginning? Let's say, when the Kingdom of Serbs, Croatians, and Slovenians started, essence of state ideology was to eradicate, to destroy Bosnia as identity, Bosnian people, and to reduce everything what was Bosnians unto Serbo-Croatian contents. Did I spend my time?
Just
I'm going
exactly.
with 2 sentences. I'm going to control the sentences. This anti-Bosnian ideology, within which is incorporated anti-Muslimism as a content of that, but not as an essence of that, was present. All this time was forgotten and outside of the, as people used to say today, radar, or insight of researchers. It survived through communist period, and it survived after the genocide. Today, anti-Bosnian ideology is more powerful than before genocide. So we have now all 4 preconditions for repetition of the genocide. No matter of how high is probability that new genocide will happen, we have now very, very open anti-Bosnian ideology, which is precondition for genocide. We have armed inheritors of the genocide in Bosnia with more founded situation, politically, economically, and so on. We have executors, of course, we can have them anytime, and we have situation that elite organizations, ideology, perpetrators could be envisaged as a president. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mahmoud Shahaj. Our next speaker is Ori Goldberg on the Israeli response to accusations of ethnic cleansing, policy, memory, and self-repression.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Desmond. What a pleasure it is to be here. Thank you very much, the forum, for inviting me.
Nice to have you back.
It was very good to see you all. Following, I think my presentation unwittingly will follow Rusmir's words. In Israel, we have, and since I'm among friends, I'm allowing myself to speak frankly. In Israel, we have issues with the concept of genocide because we feel that it was the genocide perpetrated on European Jewry that defined the term for the world, and that any expression, manifestation, execution of genocide is a variation on a theme that was defined in our foundational experience. So we are, Israelis are perfectly willing to acknowledge genocide, but we have trouble with substantive discussions on the nature of it because we keep returning, and this has something to do with what Paul said earlier, we keep returning to ourselves. We keep encountering ourselves in any public discussion we have about genocide. The notion of ethnic cleansing, however, is a matter for some real debate in Israel, and I want to share with you 2, perhaps 3 points about the nature of that discussion. This is an interesting day to speak about ethnic cleansing, Israel's response to ethnic cleansing. It's a day after the Israeli High Court finally discussed the issue of the Jerusalem neighborhood, Sheikh Jarrah, which is populated by Palestinians who were placed there by Jordanian authorities before Israel conquered Jerusalem in the 1967 war. This is the subject of intense debate. And the first point I want to make about Israeli responses to accusations of ethnic cleansing is that in Israel, we have a national obsession with how our policy is seen and understood. There is very little discussion about substantive policy. That is, the Israeli state does not usually take responsibility for policy on the ground. It prefers to present that policy as a necessity created through lack of choice. But there is a national obsession with Israel's ability to present, explain, mediate Israeli policy to an unwitting world. Right? That is, we are convinced that the world at large, okay, and that really is, I think, the tone of the general Israeli discussion about these things. We are convinced that the world at large doesn't understand the Israeli experience. and it has no idea what it means to be an Israeli, specifically, of course, an Israeli Jew, but an Israeli that is not a Palestinian or not one of Israel's numerous enemies in the region. And because that is the case, we are very eager as a collective to invest as much labor as possible in explaining our efforts and making sure the world understands. But there is a significant gap between any potential discussion of policy and this obsession with appearance or representation. We invest a lot more energy in efforts of representation than we do in significant policy discussion. We tend to shy away from a significant policy discussion. And the matter of ethnic cleansing is precisely an issue where this gap is perhaps the most apparent. Does Israel have a policy of actively shaping the geographical space of the occupied territories and disputed areas like the eastern part of Jerusalem in order to expand Jewish presence and detract from Palestinian presence? It does. Okay? Is this strategy that is a matter for political contention? To some extent, at least at a public level, it is. Effectively, one could say that from the early 1970s onwards, Israeli governments belonging to both the left and the right were co-opted by the people who saw this as a top national priority and have cooperated with the desire to minimize Palestinian presence in the territories and expand Jewish presence. There are various forms in which this is done. They are not, violent in a sense of rounding up a Palestinian population or forceful deportations, but what the Israeli efforts lack in intensity, they make up for in diversity and variety, right? And by the way, this is backed up by official documents, okay, that specify the strategies meant to expand Jewish presence and minimize or hinder Palestinian presence. But we have a very, very difficult time when accusations of ethnic cleansing are made with Israel. We will immediately refer to anybody who makes such accusations as a terrorist, or somebody who supports terrorism, because any attempt to suggest that Israeli activities in the territories amount to a recognized war crime is akin to terrorism against Israel. And we will immediately circle back to a discussion about words and not about policy. Right? Official Israeli spokespersons will demand condemnations from the world, from people who express support for somebody who accused Israel of ethnic cleansing. It's as though such accusations are not a trigger for intensified attempts at justifying Israel's position. Rather, they are a trigger for a collective national sense of being appalled. Israel, guilty of ethnic cleansing. How could that be? We would never do anything like that. We were the victims of, the original war crimes that defined improper treatment of civilian populations. We don't have it in our DNA. We're simply incapable. And to prove that we are incapable, we will now bore your ear off by explaining endlessly and tirelessly what it is that we actually do. We don't need to explain why it doesn't amount to ethnic cleansing, right? Ethnic cleansing is something that we are simply incapable of perpetrating. We would never do that. We've got security contingencies. We've got policy necessities. We've got a hostile region that surrounds us, leaving us absolutely no choice. But we would never actively either espouse or carry out a policy of ethnic cleansing. And what happens in Israel is that discussions are dragged down to the level of detail. This court case that was heard yesterday by Israel Supreme Court is a great example. What happened is that corporations started by prominent right-wing political activists, people who were affiliated with the settler movement in the territories, claimed ownership of a large number of buildings and homes in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood. And thank you, Desmond. I'm bringing it to a close. And claimed ownership, as Jews can claim ownership to, there was under Jewish ownership before 1948 when Israel was founded. The Palestinians do that. So the settlers bring a case to the court and say, we're the owners. The Palestinians refuse to acknowledge that ownership and demand legal status in their homes. And what the Israeli Supreme Court does is say, we can't accept either version. You know, if we accept the settler version, then we're opening up Pandora's box. We're going to be subject to any number of lawsuits that will never end. If we accept the Palestinian version, we're undermining the entire rationale for Israel's legal control of the occupied territories. So what the Israeli Supreme Court did, or tried to do, was suggest a settlement where the Palestinians would be given some sort of protected status in the territories, but the ownership of the settlers would be recognized. And that's exactly where the Israeli discussion about ethnic cleansing is. We will never acknowledge ethnic cleansing is something we need to deal with, something we are doing. What we will do is talk either about extensive detail, which is or taking away the cachet of ethnic cleansing, or we will talk about what we talk about when we talk about ethnic cleansing. Thank you, and sorry for.
Thank you very much. And we're doing fine for time at the moment, I think. So thank you. And I will come back to the things you had to say there in the comments. I think that there are some things that are very relevant to the situation here too. Okay. Our next speaker is Paul Ballenfat on the power of nothingness, mass laughter, and the foundation of political community. Paul, the floor is yours.
Yeah, hello. I hope the light is not too bad. Well, first, hello everybody. I'm happy to be with you after such a long time and such a difficult confinement. And I'm gonna read some things I wrote for this occasion. So since I have very little time, as I discovered lately, I'll just give some very brief, small marginal notes or fragments that will just outline the premises of what has to be said in the direction of this question. Just a little remark at the beginning. Strangely enough, I sent my title with a mistake that has not been noticed. So of course the title would have been Mass Slaughter and not Mass Laughter. And you see, with communication, it has become this mass laughter, and I would leave this question aside, but I'll keep it as a kind of hideaway and sideway, or hidden sideway, by what I'm going to say. So I just made some points, and I read these points that are very, very schematical and very, how could I say, concentrated and somehow caricatural. But as you know, with the last events last year's, our president, French president, ascribed caricature as the new French national identity. So I'm doing some kind of caricature so as to be some kind of French, according to our president's desire. So first, I think there is no more urging actuality for thinking than evil, or rather the power to evil, of which I need to recall immediately that it is precisely the way the essence of self-attesting soul is spotted in the Quran. Second, if death is the horizon, like in Heidegger, for instance, that constitutes timing as history, with a very intricate and terrifying entanglement, such as German idealism, Reread Christianity. It can be this hypothesis and stand for limits only because it is unveiled through killing. In other terms, we can die by chance because we understand dying as a killing which has always forever ascribed us responsibility. 3. Death thus intertwines decisively for existence, nature and culture, or rather the Ionian physis and the elate being of which Plato's invention of politics is physis, that rereads physis as what is submitted and organized by the technological knowledge of philosophy. This synthesis being later on interpreted as metaphysics. 4. Politics consists in erecting the totality of the beings, namely the world, under the light of absolute being that grants thinking, while ordering knowing beings so as to achieve this totality. The world is thus already always political and requires thinking to be the technology of knowledge. 5. As soon as politics, as the system of the world being, becomes actual, thinking with Plato, it includes at least 3 conditions. First, organizing sexuality. Second, distinguishing ruler and ruled on the edge of the difference between truth and lie that defines the essence of saying. 3, death penalty. It is remarkable that all the philosophers, except Derrida, finally, stand for death penalty. 6. In short, the 3 conditions require power so as to be fulfilled, though the possibility of achieving the essence of politics is several times in Plato's Republic described as a mere probability or likelihood that can occur only because it would be the repetition of what is supposed to have happened previously, at least once by chance, like the philosophers to be produced through politics can come to being only because the philosopher by chance happened once, Socrates. 7. Hence, what the political machine both hides and reveals, betraying compulsively its dissimulation, is power. This power that is in a very decisive way described in the Timaeus of Plato, under the name of ananke, constraint. It is dissimulated twice actually by its problematization that always merely asks, the power of whom, the power to what? 8. When we come to mass slaughter, I prefer this word to genocide that is too narrow and misleading with its juridical definition. And that would draw us from, how could I say, the claim for justice or the call of justice to the affirmation of rights, which is completely different. We put it to questions so as to try answering both how it is possible and how we avoid it. These 2 questions that problematize these recurring occurrences are precisely a trick belonging to the essence of power. There is no way we can understand the possibility of mass slaughter. We can write tons of history books that will assume that they'll explain something of the possibility of the genocide, but they will never get to it. And there is no way we could avoid it, as experience teaches us. I remind you that since Second World War, my country, France, has been accomplice to 2 genocides at the same time, the genocide in Bosnia and the genocide in Rwanda. Though we, every time, almost every week, we commemorate the genocide, we remember the genocide, we teach everybody the genocide. 9. Political machine is technology. as the structure of thinking that aims at knowing the technological things we call beings by grasping them in the concept. Politics happens only if there is a goal and means to reach this goal. The difference between finality and means is the basis of any technological built thinking. This fundamental difference requires an effective power to enforce its law and to bring it to efficiency. 10. Power, thus, is what has to be questioned in its essence through or on the edge of this difference without enacting it. Going through without taking use is like walking a road without our feet being supported by it. 11. Evil is what is supposed to be at use for the good of the goal. It is a means for a goal, and at the same time it shapes the concept of means. Evil being a means for good implies that a means is already always evil besides the goal. The means is what has to be overcome so as to reach the goal. The means is at the same time what allows moving ahead towards the goal and what threatens to prevent going ahead. It is both a passage and an obstacle. A means is already always mean. This structure is fundamentally theological. 12. The concept of God includes in its concepts, as such, the relation between concealment and revelation, between God hiding in its essence and God revealed as man. History is always a hierarchy history that requires a hierarchy, which distinguishes between the God to come and the man to be overcome, between the achieved goal and the disqualified means. 13. Evil comes into visibility in 19th century. Slowly, it invades the totality of what Plato was calling the visible, and finally settles in the intelligibility of the visible in the concept, or what the neo-scientists, ignorant of the metaphysical constructions of nowadays, call cognitive. 14. 19th century is the century of the rise of modern capitalism based on both capitalization and technologization of capital, of which human being through the exploitation of work is just a part of it and not the center. It is also the century of a new elaboration of politics with two phases. The invention of people and nation, coinciding with the fundamental metaphysical couple, presentation, representation, Vorstellung, and the invention of the idiotic leader with Napoleon, as Heidegger suggested in the introduction of his Schelling book about freedom. 15, the idiotic leader, the Führer, nowadays the Reis, is not the old ruler. It is not even the tyrant that is defined by Plato as the anti-savior, who saves the essence of politics against the tyrant who destroys it. He has also, of course, some of the tyrant's character, but he is merely pure action. He gathers in himself politics and science, revealing the unity of politics as destruction and science as technology. He is as much idiotic as he is technological and scientific. 16. The modern leader realizes the unity of stupidity and science by becoming the political performativity of technology. His actions are always the translation of scientific knowledge, and science research is the best means to achieve his techno-political goal. Politics becomes the total scientific system for transforming the totality of beings, including human beings, in the totality of means, exhibiting the absoluteness of the system, which is understood by Hegel as the system of the absolute spirit. 17. This system is the theological redemption through science of nature that becomes truly the manifestation of the absolute principle, namely God. We have never been more theological than now. Nature becomes thus being as the totality of pure substances, all equal to one another, so as to be disponible for being used to express the glory of the principle. Remember that in his meditations, Descartes, all the time, each time he closes one meditation, chants the glory of God. In our late modernity, the whole techno-capitalist system is the fusion of finance, namely desire or sex, technology, namely power of free domination, and theology, namely the intelligible freedom of the absolute supreme being. In this regard, self-proclaimed Islamicism and America are the same symptom of the same term. 8. Power is what is acting within this turn, and this process is nothing else than the epiphany of power as such. The essence of this metaphysical system is empowering power, indifferent to its being concentrated in a specific place, the state, the leader, or disseminated all over the totality of being, as in the Nazi system, which was very decentralized. 19. Power is the decentralized, and this decentralization, has been tested and built in during First World War. So it is directly from the war that the structure of the power is organized in Nazi system. 19. Power is the ambiguity of foundation. Power is coming to power. It is empowerment process, pure performativity. Speech acts theory unveils performativity as the essence of language, assuming and reinforcing the metaphysical essence of language. And it is, of course, the expression of this epiphany of power in modernity. 20. Power is an ambiguous ambiguity. First, unveiling itself as beginning and hiding the probability of the beginning in the secret of its essence. Namely, we never know why we start this or that, since the start is always as such a self-unveiling, thus veiling by being the self-institution of the self, whatever would be excluded from it. This is why, by the way, lie is the essence of truth, and why Plato, for instance, thinks so strongly and so deeply the question of lie within the essence of truth. Power is a non-begun beginning. Second, it is the erection of being that betrays the non-beingness of being, as suggests Walter Benjamin in his interpretation of Paul Klee's painting. Hence, it is the erection of nothingness. The power is empowering nothingness as being. It is exhibiting by its being technological, nothingness as being. Power is always the nothingness power to reveal being. It is thus the art of nothingness. It is the exhibition of nothingness as being. Thus, it acts being through nothingness, and therefore, it empowers construction as destruction, beginning as ending, saving the people by slaughtering massively all the people. And how could I say, the redemption of the people goes through the extermination of the people. That's the logic of modern politics. 21. The elaboration of the concept of unity in Middle Eastern thinking tradition parts the concept of God between God as sovereignty and God as authority. Sovereignty rules automatically over all the things, while authority commands through laws that prescribe responsibility. The sovereign essence of unity is what remains in its secrecy, hidden within majesty, Jalal, which is precisely the name for power. The lordly authority manifests itself as the author of the beauty of totality. The machine of unity plays with the ambiguity of power. It is both the God that is power that hides, and the God that its power reveals by translating it into being. Power happens to be both the hiding and the revealing and empowered of gods. Mass destruction is the manifestation. 22. Mass destruction is the manifestation of the power of the essence to begin its being a principle, and principle self-destruction. The erection of God as the absolute self-principle in the Abrahamic lineage ends with the radical deconstruction and confirmation at the same time of the principle. In the Quran, God is both absolute and anti-absolute. It is both self-erecting and self-destroying. 23rd, to finish, it's my conclusion. The turn of modernity reveals the inner ambiguity of power by transforming definitely the things into beings, of which the essence is to be the means for the revelation of the essence power. Power can be revealed as such only by gathering the things into the massiveness, the total quantumification of the things that equate anything to anything. Equality is ultimately, at least since Aristotle, and hence by Rousseau, the essence of beingness. Power reveals itself by achieving the total equality of the equal beings. Mass destruction or mass slaughter became thus the way this equality is brought to its absoluteness, revealing the absolute character of the essence. The turn of Judaism to Christianity and further on to Islam brings to visibility the historical character of the essence that can ultimately manifest itself only through a final mass destruction, namely apocalypse. And my last word will be a remembering of, maybe you remember this word that had been brought by Dutch, who was the director of S21 Cambodia Red Khmer camp, that was saying, if you die, we lose nothing. If you live, we earn nothing. This is exactly what it is about, with equality as the essence of being. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. As far as I can tell, Sonia is still not with us, so therefore our final speaker is Edina Bećirović. Edina, are you there? Hello, Edina?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, can now. Okay. So, Edina, you are going to be talking on the rulings of the Hague Tribunal and some interpretations of the concept of genocide.
Okay, yes, but I would also like to say that Sonia is with us. I mean, I can talk now, but Sonia told me that she is there. It's only you can't see her on camera because she's using mobile. So maybe while
Sonia there?
I'm speaking, maybe you can coordinate with her, because she said that she hears us.
Okay, the only, sorry, there is one user present with the name Honor9. Is that you, Sonia?
I mean, I can go now. Sonia can go after me.
Yep,
maybe
sure.
Maybe you
Sure.
can
Edina.
communicate with Sonia in the meantime.
Yeah.
So the key question I would like to discuss with this panel is how crucial are the verdicts of the Hague Tribunal and other relevant courts for the interpretation of the broader historical context. One thing is certain is that judicially established facts about genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes, those established in the Hague Tribunal, but also in other courts, according to the amendment of the criminal law imposed by the High Representative of Bosnia and Herzegovina, will be the basis for prosecuting individuals denying those verdicts and denying those crimes. But another question I hear a lot these days, I mean, it's been discussed for years, but I hear a lot these days, particularly after the High Representative imposed the amendment to the criminal law, is whether historians, genocide and war crimes researchers should rely solely on verdicts when establishing wider historical interpretation. For example, a friend from Prijedor, who is a victim of genocide, asked me, can he now, and he is an activist, can he now, since the Hague Tribunal has not confirmed genocide for Prijedor, can he still continue to argue the genocide took place in Prijedor in 1992? Even before the verdicts in Mladić and Karadžić case, there have been authors whose writings on this issue was conveniently compatible with verdicts from individual court cases at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, according to which genocide in Srebrenica committed in July 1992, is the only instance of genocidal intent in the wider ethnic cleansing campaign that took place in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Often it is implied that the events in Srebrenica were an inevitable result of that campaign of violence, but a distinction is made between the nature of that campaign and genocide in July 1992. So we can say that for quite some time, there was a number of authors who were in a way politically correct, and their interpretation was in line with the interpretation of the Bosnian War promoted by majority international decision makers. And it is fact that those international decision makers ignore their duty to prevent genocide, not only in Srebrenica, but in many other locations in Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1992. So use of the term ethnic cleansing that Marko mentioned instead of genocide matters more than it may seem when it comes to international accountability. I would also like to mention the latest verdict against Ratko Mladic, which has captured regional and world attention, and which also indicates that court rulings and established facts have significant shortcomings, and that we shouldn't really rely only on judgments when giving broader historical interpretation. I was shocked hearing and also later reading separate opinion of the presiding judge in Mladic's case. Really, if it was up to the presiding judge, she would have acquitted Mladic. But also with regard to charges of genocide for 1992 in other municipalities mentioned in his judgment, the two judges had dissenting opinions, and according to them, Srebrenica is not the only case of genocide. So we see that the judges who reviewed all that broad evidence had major disagreements on some crucial issues, and one of them is genocide. So I'm sure that these Hague Tribunal judgments will be a case study for studying the implicit bias in judges' decision making. It seems to me that using judicially established truths to qualify mass crimes in Bosnia or anywhere else should not be the only method genocide researchers apply. So original evidence introduced in courts has already been processed by the judges within the context of establishing the guilt of an indicted individuals. So even if individual criminal responsibility for genocide committed during certain periods of time in particular territories is not established, it is not inherently true that genocide did not take place. It only means that the judges in particular case could not corroborate the responsibility of the individual on trial. So verdicts concerning genocide are particularly interesting, and these subjective impressions of judges who interpret evidence or the implicit bias of judges will be important for the future genocide cases as well. So this reality was also obvious in the first historical judgments of the ICJ in the case of Bosnia and Herzegovina versus Serbia, which failed to establish responsibility of the state of Serbia and to fully implement the 1948 Genocide Convention, because this judgment was a radical departure from historical judges. It simply totally openly did not take into account all available evidence, primarily that which was used in the ICTY, for example, in Milosevic case. The ICTY gave guarantees to the state of Serbia that this evidence would not be disclosed to any third party, including the ICJ, without the agreement of the Serbian government. I mean, I need to remind that these documents were decisive in the procedural ruling against Milosevic. And after hearing the prosecution evidence, judges in Milosevic's case ruled that Milosevic is basically responsible for genocide from 1992 and not only genocide in Srebrenica in 1995, and that he shared with joint criminal enterprise, participants of the joint criminal enterprise, the aim and intention to destroy a part of the Bosnian Muslim as a group. Therefore, I was in a way relieved to hear the presiding judge in the case of Stanisic and Simatovic. He basically gave the advice to researchers, to historians, to use judgments as a guide to contextualize the wartime documents, testimonies, and the rich tribunal archive. The way I understood his advice is that the wider historical truth should not be overshadowed with the final verdict. So therefore, I can say in the end that I will continue to argue the genocide in Bosnia is the process which began in 1992 and culminated with genocide in Srebrenica in July 1995. Have you managed to get in touch with Sonia?
Sonia has changed her name and she has appeared in the list of participants. Okay. So,
you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you, Sonia.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry for this misunderstanding or my lack of knowledge to communicate over the mobile because I couldn't connect with my computer. Well, I'm glad I have listened to this panel because there were many interesting theses and many interesting opinions, and I would in this I would just continue to sort of report on what Serbia is doing nowadays and how she's very much using this ongoing debate into illegal community and also through other communities about the genocide, whether it was genocide in Bosnia or not, and they are very much using this for their own denial, and they have been undermining tribunals' work from the very beginning by different strategies, and I think they have succeeded, at least when we talk about the public in Serbia, to convince them that tribunal is anti-Serb, that all these judgments are against the sort of conspiracies against Serb nation and so on, not to repeat all these qualifications. But in order to understand Serbian policy, or not only in Bosnia, but also in Serbia as well, dealing with the Muslim population generally, we have to contextualize this because this has started much earlier at the time when Ottoman Empire was collapsing. Since then, Muslim population, including Albanians, Bosniaks, and all other groups of Islamic region have been cleansed, and some kind of genocidal policies were conducted all throughout the 20th century, especially in Bulgaria, Greece, and Serbia. So this is just a continuation of the policy which started much earlier. And Serbia's propaganda much before this war started in Bosnia was already sort of not only dehumanizing, but also was creating moral atmosphere which would sort of justify their policies in Bosnia from 92 to 95 and later on in Kosovo. Of course, one of the main theses of Serbian nationalists was that Muslim fundamentalism was the main threat to survival of Yugoslavia, and later on one of the main reasons of its collapse, and it continues until today. I would just like to remember you that Serbian National Court for war crimes, had issued warrants against the top leaders in Bosnia, like Ganic, then the general, he died recently, and many others, I think 20 people or so, where they claimed that the war in Bosnia was started by Muslims against Yugoslav army, and then it was later on when Ganic was arrested and put on trial at the London court some years ago. They tried to prove this, but fortunately enough, the judge who presided the court really managed to sort of ridicule Serbian arguments. But despite this, they continued to pursue this warrant, to pursue this line. Later on, Jovan Divjak was arrested, and some of these people who are on the indictments are not able to cross Serbian border. So this policy against Muslim population, and especially in the interpretation of the war, is still ongoing. And of course, as you know, Serbia declared that it was a liberation war of Serbs in Bosnia, and that of course Bosnian side was responsible for that. And this is a narrative which has been accepted by a wider public, because being a victim and offering such an interpretation is much easier than to go seriously in what has been revealed in the Hague, but not only in the Hague. I would also like to remind you that this the continuation of Serbian policy against Bosnia as a state is still ongoing, and there are written documents which are official and are on the side of the Serbian government. I would just mention one of them, which is a strategy for diaspora, which was apparently a follow-up of a roundtable which took place in '97, which apparently at that time very unwillingly acknowledged that Dayton Agreement was the most they could get at that time. And when they came out with the strategy, which was later on published in one of the publications, where they in details explained how to preserve Republika Srpska and to obstruct return of refugees, how to integrate Republika Srpska in the Serbian space. And this was later on followed by this strategy, which was brought in 2011, and is one of the documents which is on the side of the government, exactly based on this, how should say, main points from this roundtable, which was convened in Fruška Gora. Later on, you have another document, which is charter on Serbian cultural space, which was signed by the Serbian and Republika Srpska education minister, and this is also a public government document on the site. And the third one is the strategy on security, which clearly states in one of the points saying that main priority of Serbian foreign policy is to to defend Republika Srpska. So, and of course, this also has to be viewed in the wider context, international context as well, because Serbia very much exploited this war on terror, which was declared in 2001, when they, in a way, reaffirmed their thesis about fundamentalism, which started in Yugoslavia, Bosnia, and war on terror in Kosovo, because this is how they qualified war in Kosovo. So this is, and during these years, I would say international community was disengaged in, first of all, in implementing Dayton Agreement. We all talk about Dayton Agreement, but which was never really implemented in all its aspects and annexes which it has. And the recent law passed by INSCO against deniers of genocide is relevant and welcome, but it's in a way very late, because this denial process went too far. It will take enormous energy to reconstruct Bosnia as a state, because Serbia will not give up so easily Republika Srpska, as which they treat as a military game. And in the meantime, they have incorporated truly Republika Srpska in the cultural and economic space of Serbia, just waiting for Bosnia to collapse and then to integrate it politically. So this is a continuation of the policy which is now based on this historical context, and nationalists in Serbia think that this is a unique historical moment to finalize their project and to sort of finalize their aspirations, not only in Bosnia, but also in Montenegro. You have all maybe followed what the recent developments in Montenegro, which is apparently the offensive aggression against Montenegro in a different way, but they have also been enabled to carry on with this policy due to the international, I would say, misunderstanding or wrong reading of the Montenegrin situation. They took as a priority removal of Đukanović without taking into consideration who is going to replace him. On the other hand, the minorities, Muslim minorities in Serbia, are still under special treatment, like Albanians in the south. They undergo the process of passivization, which means that once their IDs expire, they don't get the new documents with Serbian addresses, which means that they become stateless in Serbia. This relates especially to those who work abroad, gastarbeiters, or in Western Europe or in Kosovo. Also, it applies to the non-recognition of their diplomas. So the young generation which studies in Kosovo primarily is not able to get employed in south of Serbia, in Medveđa, Bujanovac, or Preševo. So this policy of administrative cleansing or institutional cleansing is continuing. So I would really look at the genocide against Muslim communities in the Balkans should be viewed in much broader context, historical context, with this special focus on Bosnia, which is still in the focus both of Croatia and Bosnia. Recently, yesterday, I think, Croatian foreign minister said that he is against high representative position to be continued, which also is matching what Serbia is doing all the time, denying the right and Russia and all those who are seeing Bosnia as a provisory state and so on. So I think that Serbia is still getting away with its, I would say, with its policy of denial, despite the fact of all this judgment that Dina was talking about, which are again used in a different way in Serbian narrative. But despite all this, Bosniaks in the meantime apparently had a new impulse and self-understanding themselves, and their new position stands towards the others. And I think this genocide has finally consolidated the Bosniak identity and their sense of constitutional nation as such. And it is not possible to manipulate with this Bosniak being, I would say. So this will very much depend, the further development of Bosnian, how to say, reality or whatever is going on will very much depend on how EU and US will behave in coming months or coming years. I don't see that they are sort of swiftly coming in with the policies, though much of that was announced in the campaign of Biden and also in their meetings with the European leaders. They have promised common policy and profound changes in their behavior in the region. But I would say that this is all far-fetched still. I hope that this is going to be effective, but I'm not sure how quickly. On the other side, I would also like to point out that Serbia at this moment is undergoing severe and very profound crisis as a fact of these very affairs emerging on the surface, which was triggered by America, by United States. And this is the only way, I would say, to confront Serbia with new policies without tolerating it as the biggest state in the Western Balkans, as a state which they perceive as a major factor for stability or destability, but still it was for too long tolerated with all these policies. And hopefully what is going on now in Serbia might result with some new openings and breakthroughs for the region. I'm not convinced how quickly. For example, Vučić at this moment is trying to be very constructive. He was not that negative about the law, but he was negative. On the other side, he initiated this new open Balkan sort of story with North Macedonia and Albania, which is just an empty, I would say, story without much substance. This is just to show that he is constructive, because at this point, I don't see his way out. And it will very much depend what how America will continue to treat Serbia and its criminal legacy, which is enormous. And it is also affecting Serbian society as well. So this is, I wouldn't go on because the time has run already, but I just wanted to point out a few things which might be relevant for reflecting on what is expected to happen in Bosnia.
Thank you very much, Sonia. And my apologies for having to shift people around like that, but it was well worth the wait. We have, in spite of my lax time management, managed to finish this without using up absolutely all, well, just about all of our discussion time. However, with people's permission, I would still ask whether or not anybody wants to ask any questions, make comments on things, or initiate a discussion with other panelists.
Znači, stigli smo kod, evo ovako, našla sam aktivity 1.
Okay. Right. Sorry, Paul. As far as I can see, you have your hand up. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. I would like just to add a little to what Ori said about terrorism. And I was thinking while he was speaking that I believe terrorism is a kind of political expression that is meant only to justify the state of exception. And this state of exception is somehow the shape we give to civil war in a very classical Hobbesian understanding, if I may say. So we organize civil war because we cannot let it go, just like this, and we find a way to shape it and to keep it under the control of the state. And terrorism is useful for this. So that was my little comment. And that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Paul. I don't know whether Ari wanted to respond to that. Okay, if nobody else has any comment to make, I actually do have one that I would like to make, and that involves asking a question as well. A question which would be to Ori, but I'd be very happy to hear the views of Barbara and Shraga as well on this. And Ori, in your talk, you gave the example of the courts dealing with land and the restitution and so forth, which seemed to me to be a perfect example of what Lyotard is talking about in terms of the different, where there are simply two incompatible narratives going on, and that the court has to mediate between them with a systematically distorted response, and one that creates a sense of victimhood and a position of and an imposition of silence. That seems to me to be related to part of the issue of genocide overall, as it's been discussed, insofar as genocide as the crime of crimes, as Shabas calls it, creates a hierarchization of all the other types. A lot of speakers were talking about widening the definition, that the definition, the legal definition, doesn't work exactly for historical work or other type of work. But the fact is that all the other things like mass slaughter, as Paul referred to it, or crimes against humanity and so on, Chavez has again argued that that the law has been extended in these other areas to create adequate legal concepts, but the victims and the perpetrators want everything to come under the genocide label, which has to do with the way in which, again, the Jewish experience is paradigmatic. It's the paradigm case against which everything has to be dealt. And you talked about that. So I'm wondering here about whether or not it is actually possible to de-hierarchize that and make genocide one crime amongst others. I doubt that it is, because I think it's got to do with the paramount importance of the nation concept or the nation symbol itself, and the Jewish position with regard to that historically. And the second thing then, is how do you think that this may be related to the way in which the Bosnian genocide has been received, particularly by Holocaust experts in Israel?
Thank you, Desmond. Those are both very good questions. With regard to the point in principle about de-hierarchization, I have to, get a little bit theological in replying. The very basic monotheistic concept that is so primal to both Judaism and Islam with regard to God, where we begin from him and we go to him, that is human movement, okay? You could make somewhat of an analogy with regard to genocide as the crime of crimes. And in that sense, we're not committing any other crime but genocide. But exactly in that sense as well, or the other side of that coin, is that we are either committing genocide or we're not. You can't dispute a primal truth, right? And if we're not, then that gives rise to an infinite sort of purgatory, where we are always waiting to ascertain whether we are committing genocide or not, but we're also off the hook because we're obviously not, since we're in purgatory. And the theological mindset, I think, is important here when you're talking about, when you're suggesting a de-hierarchization, then you're suggesting a very balanced, sensible look at it. You're saying there's a problem here because we can't seem to effectively apply definitions of international law as long as we've got genocide hogging all the limelight here. But I think one of the reasons that genocide still manages to do that is because the treatment of genocide latches on to this theological dimension, this religious dimension, this movement that a lot of people, certainly in Israel, recognize intuitively, this movement that is constantly taking place between a similar beginning and end. I hope that wasn't too out there as a reply, but I really think you raised an interesting point. I think the only way to approach its manifestations in reality is to understand, I'll use this word for lack of a better one, the spiritual dimensions of applying genocide to an actual effective reality. I think it's a very important insight that you've just raised here. With regard to the Bosnian genocide, well, again, what Israelis would say, at least as far as I know, from literature on genocide here, there are those who certainly acknowledge it and will present it as an interesting legal case or as a development of potential international thought about genocide. But I think most, not lay persons, but people who are somewhat in the know would talk about the Bosnian genocide as a case of and this goes back to what Paul was saying, as a case of the corruption of power. Right? Power as a non-beginning, Paul said. And because that is the case, because I think they would intuitively, even if they didn't have Paul's sage definition, they would intuitively accept the notion of power, of evil and power, or power as a non-beginning, then the story of the Bosnian genocide would be, a trope. It would be something that is universal in a sense, but something that could occur anywhere and everywhere. It would lack the exceptional nature of the genocide experienced by Jews. Okay? That's just a story of people getting too big for their britches, of an imbalance of power, of the two big, mean types ganging up on the small, weaker type. It's not an earth-shattering story. Right? It's not something that redefined the world. it's an instance, it's an instance of people's wickedness. And in that sense, it's not quite like the Jewish genocide that had in it all the evils of modernity, that brought an entire array of demons, not to say a collective id, up to the surface. So we're certainly willing to acknowledge the Bosnian genocide here, but it's not quite apples and oranges, but it's not the same category in that sense. I think that would be the sort of general Israeli perception of it.
Thank you very much. I was thinking in particular of the two reports that recently came out here with Greif and Israelis' involvement, and of course the impact that has on public opinion here and elsewhere.
Sure, I assumed as much. I guess what I said would, I think, at least in my opinion, represent the general Israeli discourse on genocide and where the Bosnian genocide would fit in. The attempts to both localize it and locate Bosnian genocide on within a grander continuum, I think will most likely go way above the general scope of Israeli discourse on the subject. They'd be specialized, and again, they'd have to do with a lot of extensive detail, not just the gruesome bits, but this understanding that in order to express or acknowledge genocide, that it is within the realm of the genocide that Israeli Jews know so intuitively, one would have to go about performing piecemeal work, very carefully stitching up all the details, and then eventually cross some critical mass that would make that genocide reverberate effectively.
Thank you very much. That has, at least to me, been very helpful. Barbara, you'd like to add something?
Yes, I would like to pick that up. Hi, Ori. Good to see you. So it's great to see some people, also Paul and Ori. We all met at the all met at the Hartman Institute. So I just mentioned that not just because of nostalgia, but because there was another philosopher present at the Hartman Institute, but not at our theological conferences. So it's a philosopher, Adi Ophir, who is actually the Israeli philosopher who really thought about the uniqueness of the Shoah and genocide in terms of a philosophical ethics, of a moral ethics. And one of his main points, so he was discussing the uniqueness of the Shoah, which is already, for any Israeli, that is already a critical act, to put a question mark on the uniqueness of the Shoah. That's what he did. He came to the conclusion that it's unique in certain aspects and not unique in other aspects. But he's doing this discussion in his book. It's called, the English translation is called The Order of Evils, and the Hebrew original title is phenomenal. It's Lashon La Ra. Everybody would think immediately that it's evil talk, but the literary translation is a language for evil. So the main idea about this monumental work that he wrote 20 years ago is to increase language about genocide and the Shoah. So because there's a language reduction in the Israeli mind, that's something that Ori referred to, that everything is either genocide or it's not genocide, and of course nothing is like the Shoah, and these things, these ideas are repeated and they are narrowed. Instead Adi Ophir was asking philosophically, so what is unique about the Shoah, and what does the Shoah have in common with other genocides? And so, but the idea is to stretch language and first of all not to start everything that's evil with the Shoah. So that this is, I think this applies also to the discussion about genocide. It's not only when you have that term, then there's something preventable starting. Also, ethnic cleansing has to be prevented. Also, everything that is 1 degree below is already many degrees too high for our moral standards. And so the idea of adiofir is to increase language, to get the language also going, to ask specifically. So what are the unique aspects of this? And then of course we do need the terms for the general for the international jurisdictive, because that is where juridically people the international community comes into play. So here I would like to make the bridge to the interreligious ethics that I'm working on something like that, that in interreligious ethics, the prevention of genocide has to have a special and explicit place, and it needs to be evoked as the question of specific responsibilities. So we are, as citizens of the world, we are responsible to prevent any genocide that's happening, of course, but that might be too general for action. So the question, for example, I've been working a lot on the question of genocidal thought patterns in Christian thought that go together with supersessionist thinking. So if in traditional supersessionist thinking, the idea, which is, by the way, dogmatically, not only ethically but also dogmatically wrong, that the idea that Christianity has successfully superseded, replaced Judaism. It was never dogmatically correct, and it was never a nice idea, but that can be detected as genocidal religious thinking, and that is why it's and of course after the Shoah, that was many officially baptized people killing Jews and have that as their specific aim. Of course, any Christian supersessionism is not only is ethically, but it's also theologically it's done with. Okay, that is one structure. But now positively, I think that I would derive from that a particular Christian responsibility, as a specific Christian responsibility to prevent genocide as a main and major task of Christian ethics. So my question would be, what other specific tasks of this can be developed in interreligious discourse. So it's the ethics of witness, the ethics to interreligious ethics, to listen to witness, then to tell, then to yes, and to ask how to prevent genocide. There is also that in Israel among Israeli scholars. So Ori, I just want to give you a very, so I would just want to resume with the tiny hermeneutics of Ori Goldberg. What you hear from him is what he says as a critical Israeli thinker. Okay, so you have to keep that in mind. So among the Israelis that he rightfully criticizes are the extremely critical, which is always in self-criticism, extremely critical thinkers. One of them, Yehuda Bauer, who is a historian of the Holocaust, and he has been for decades asking this question: how do you prevent genocide? and started an organization to prevent genocide and all that. So so that's Yehuda Bauer as a historian. We have the philosophers, we have the historians. My gilda of the theologians is way behind. That's
Okay, thank you very much. In fact, Yehuda Bauer was one of the people in my mind, insofar as, according to an article a couple of years ago in Haaretz by a lady called Pelud, and as developed by Israel Charney in online comments, Bauer is one of the people who at time who seems ambivalent as to recognizing whether or not genocide actually happened in Bosnia, which doesn't seem like an enormously good starting position for preventing it happening again. But thank you very much for your comments. So, given that this is now run quite a bit over, if there are no more comments, I would ask, or if nobody else wants to say anything. Sorry, Edina, was that you raising your hand?
I'm sorry, I have a lot going on around me now.
Okay, sorry.
But I've shared something in the chat as a contribution to what you were saying.
Okay, yes, I see that. Okay, yes.
In comparison of Holocaust and genocide in Bosnia. So I've just shared this quote from the book Peter Maas wrote.
Sure, that's been shared with everybody, so that so I won't read it.
Shared with everybody, I think.
Okay. Does anyone else wish to make a comment or say anything? Okay. If not, then I would ask Professor Mahmoud Shahic to commence with his closing address for the conference.
Thank you, Desmond. I have many questions for everybody, but I myself constrain this challenge to ask you to try to identify many disagreements among us. These disagreements are the best we can find on the conference, on any conference, because they are keeping the door open for continuation of our discussions, exchanges, so on. And it is obviously that almost everything with which we have been faced has many perspectives, many answers, and we can get closer to the truth through discussion, through recognizing and accepting each other. Let's say, as Barbara said, through interfaith, permanency of interfaith communications. I would like to express thankfulness to everybody. It was, in my view, a great achievement. And I invite you to continue our contacts in different conferences here in International Forum Bosnia and somewhere else. And I invite you to send us your papers. We will accept all of them for procedure to be published in our journal Forum Bosnia. I find that all presentation can be excellent basis for good papers. Thank you very much again. God bless you. See you again. In this way, I declare that the conference is closed.